I must begin by apologising for not being with you in person today. After I had gratefully accepted the kind invitation to speak at this conference, I was invited to a family wedding on the very same day. I'm glad it's proved possible to record this contribution for you, and my biggest regret is not to be able to hear the other papers and engage in the discussion which I'm sure will be stimulated by so many fine speakers. I hope that none of what I say here will have already been convincingly controverted by one or more of them. It's more than 30 years since I wrote an article in the Laws of Galloway. It was subtitled A Preliminary Survey because it was written to clear the ground, not so much for further study of the laws themselves as for an aspect of those laws that seemed to be relevant for other research that I was carrying out at the time. That other research was on the Carrick family of Kennedy of Dunure in the 14th and especially 15th centuries. After the Laws of Galloway was published in 1991, I went on to write two more articles on the Kennedys and the continuing importance for them of their entitlement to kenkynnol, headship of their kindred, which certainly lasted into the second half of the 15th century. Now, I don't want to say too much about the Kennedys today, interesting though they undoubtedly are, but the general point is still worth making. Kenkynnol was an aspect of lordship drawn from a Gaelic-speaking culture in southwest Scotland, including Galloway, but the Kennedys, a family increasingly close to the King of Scots and engaging in active public life in both the Scottish kingdom and the Scottish Church, saw no incompatibility between those roles and their ongoing Gaelic inheritance in Carrick. Today, however, I want to focus on the laws themselves as evidence for Gaelic Galloway, touching also on the extent to which they differed, or not, from the laws and customs of other Gaelic-speaking parts of medieval Scotland, and indeed from the common law of the kingdom as a whole. My approach is to summarise the main points made in my original article, supplementing them as we go with material from my later papers, and also the writings of others, and expressing one or two new thoughts along the way. There existed in medieval Galloway and Carrick up into the 15th century a form of lordship known as kenkynnol, from the Gaelic kenkynnol, head of kindred. This could also be Latinized as capitanius de tota parentela sua, chief or captain of all his kindred or clan. This lordship could be the subject of a grant or even a royal confirmation before the end of the 13th century, although these grants generally did not say much about the lordship so granted. There are a number of further such grants in the later medieval period, as well as other evidence of named kin groups in Galloway and Carrick. Under the styles for the grants, the grantee might be constituted head of his own kindred or of another kin group, and he enjoyed the entitlements of the office by right and according to the laws and customs of Galloway as used hitherto for such captains or chiefs. The grant commanded all members of the kindred to do what should be justly done for the chief under the laws and customs of Galloway, and also prohibited doing anything against the grant. The style made no reference, however, to the grant being to the grantee and his heirs. On the death of a head of kin in Galloway, the office did not pass to a next in line, as ordinarily land would have done, that is to say, to the previous holder's nearest lawful agnate, typically his eldest surviving son born in marriage, or, in the absence of a male heir, to females. If more than one daughter, then the inheritance was shared. Now, these rules about succession to land were quite firmly established in Scotland by the 13th century under both canon and the developing secular common law. But it's very clear that in the same period, a woman could not become head of her kindred, while it was also possible for a male who was illegitimate under the canon law nonetheless to become head of his kindred. The latter situation probably often arose as a result of Celtic secular marriage customs in Galloway, or at least recognition of concubinage with a woman of sufficiently high status, as also providing sufficient status for the acknowledged offspring of the relationship. Our earliest known kenkynnol transaction was almost certainly triggered by the prospective death of the office holder, Neil, Earl of Carrick, with only a daughter, Marjorie, as a direct descendant. You may find it helpful at this point to have an eye on handout 1. Marjorie succeeded to the earldom on Neil's death sometime between 1255 and 1260, but he had previously granted the headship of the Carrick kindred to Roland and, significantly, his heirs. Now, how precisely Roland was related to Neil and Marjorie is unknown, but the late Dr. Andrew MacQueen argued that the two men were first cousins, as each the child of a different son of Earl Duncan of Carrick, the kindred's progenitor in the late 12th century. The probability is that Roland was the only surviving, or perhaps the only fit, male descendant of Earl Duncan. But it is also possible, despite the reference to Roland's heirs, that some form of election had taken place within the kindred, with Neil's grant following thereupon. Around 20 years later, 1276, there was a royal confirmation of the grant of kenkynnol to Roland, again with reference to his heirs as well. This confirmation is most likely to be explained by Roland's own recent or approaching death, along with the marriage of Countess Marjorie around 1272 with Robert Bruce of Annandale, creating a potent alternative figure of authority in Carrick. Certainly by 1285, Bruce appeared to exercise the authority of kenkynnol in Carrick, although whether or not with the consent of the Carricks is unknown. But in contentious situations, royal support for the head of kin was important, as we will see further later. It also seems highly likely that in the 14th century the headship of the kindred of Carrick passed to John Kennedy of Dunure, either because the Carrick line failed altogether, or as I think more likely he was married to the last of the direct line from Earl Duncan, or was the immediate descendant of such a marriage. The kindred either chose to submit to or had imposed upon them John's headship, as a descendant of earlier Kennedys closely associated with Earl Duncan, and indeed his father Gilbert, from the late 12th century, as well as John being the most powerful lord in contemporary Carrick. John was also supported by the king, Robert II, who in October 1372 confirmed both Earl Neil's original grant and Alexander III's confirmation thereof. We can also see in other contemporary and later documents other kin groups within Carrick submitting to John and his successors as their head of kin. A situation similar to the one in mid-13th century Carrick may have arisen in the earldom of Menteith earlier in the 13th century. As summarised by the late Archie Duncan, in the King's Court in 1213, Earl Maurice, the elder of Menteith, resigned his earldom in favour of his brother Maurice the Younger, who claimed it as his right and heritage. The elder kept a life rent of some lands, and other lands were given to provide a tocher for his daughters. Was he of doubtful legitimacy, as peerage writers suggest? Or was it that having no son, but only daughters, who stood small chance of succeeding, he resigned in favour of his brother and heir male, who undertook to provide for his daughters? But it may be that the head of the Menteith kindred, while still alive, simply appointed his successor, knowing that he would leave only daughters, and additionally gained royal support for this action. The situation arose in Buchan too, when Earl Fergus died around 1212 or 1213. His only legitimate child was his daughter Marjorie, who became countess, making her husband William Comyn the first non-native Earl of Buchan. But Earl Fergus had had an illegitimate son, Adam, who may have become head of the Buchan kindred rather than the new Earl William. Likewise in Athol, where Earl Henry died about 1200, leaving an illegitimate son, Conan, and two legitimate daughters, Isabella and Forveth. The earldom was thereafter apparently vacant until around 1209, when it was granted to Thomas, the brother of Alan, Lord of Galloway, upon the former's marriage with Isabella. But might Earl Henry's illegitimate son have become head of the Athol kindred after his father's death? Perhaps the most important example of problems with female succession for the history of Galloway in the 13th century followed the 1234 death of Alan, Lord of Galloway, with 3 legitimate daughters but no legitimate sons. I refer you again to handout 1. King Alexander II insisted on the threefold partition of the lordship amongst the daughters, all of them married to English barons. Later, one of those thirds, which was not necessarily a single block of territory, was itself divided between the other two on the death of the third and her husband without heirs, while a second third was subject to further division between co-heiresses in 1265. Meantime, Alan's illegitimate son, Thomas, probably seen by at least some as now the head of the kindred of Galloway, became the focal point for a series of risings beginning in 1235, with the last of them taking place as late as 1296. Patrick of Atholl, the son of Alan's brother Earl Thomas of Atholl, might have been another candidate for the headship of the Galloway kindred after Alan's death, but for his own sudden demise, possibly a deliberate killing, in 1242, just before he reached his majority. Another possible situation for deviation of the headship of the kin from the ordinary rules of succession amongst the landed classes was where there were no males of sufficient age. In Fife, for example, the Earl was normally head of the kindred of Clan Macduff, but on several occasions in the 12th and 13th centuries when an Earl died, leaving a minor son as heir, another member of the kindred assumed the role of head. This could also be the explanation of why, when Morgrand, Earl of Mar, died in 1183, he was succeeded as Earl not by any of his sons, who were most probably still not adult, and only one of whom may have been legitimate, but by Gilchrist, whose blood relationship to Morgrand is obscure, but whose title to the earldom, and it is suggested headship of the kindred of Mar, remained unchallenged until his death between 1203 and 1211. Thereafter there was a vacancy and a dispute between the surviving sons of Morgrand and a grandson of Gilchrist through his daughter. Duncan, youngest but possibly the only legitimate son of Morgrand, did not become Earl until between 1222 and 1228. Finally, where the deceased head of kindred did have adult male descendants, the eldest representative of the senior line did not automatically take his place. There was possibly a system of election amongst the kindred, or some other form of contest between the contenders for the role, in which, if an Irish comparison is relevant, they were tested as to their physical and mental fitness to lead in both war and peace, on the nobility of their descent on the mother's as well as the father's side, and on their already established wealth and political power. Joint headship was a possible solution between contenders, and this may have been the situation between the sons of Fergus, after his overthrow as Lord of Galloway in 1160, with the older Gilbert controlling the western lands beyond the Cree, and his younger half-brother Uhtred the east. Handout 1 may be helpful once again, that the 1160 settlement owed much to the control exerted over Galloway by the King of Scots from 1160 on, is, however, suggested by, first, the brothers' denunciation of their allegiance to the King of Scots after the English capture of William the Lion in 1174, next their seeking the overlordship of Henry II of England, and finally their leading attacks on the Scottish royal castles in Galloway and their inhabitants. Finally, however, Gilbert and Uhtred fell out, and when the latter was captured by the former's supporters, they blinded and castrated their captive, thereby definitively unfitting him for any headship of the kindred. Uhtred's subsequent death from his injuries simply underlined that Gilbert was now in sole possession of the headship of the kindred of Fergus, probably remaining so until his death in 1185, despite the honour-driven hostility of Uhtred's son Roland. Gilbert's death led to a further contest, ultimately settled by King William in 1190 in favour of Roland, with Gilbert's son Duncan receiving Carrick in return for entirely yielding lordship of Galloway to his cousin. And there Duncan established the kin group, the headship of which, as we've already seen, would have its own difficulties 60 years later. What did headship of the kindred entail for those subject to it? The recent work of Davy Brune and Alice Taylor suggests that we should consider first the provincial lordship, in Scotia the mormayorship, held by the predominant kindred within a province, and then under them further less powerful kindreds, each with its own head, and more or less content to align themselves, probably on a kinship basis, with the dominant lord. The model fits quite well with what we know of the lordship and clans of Galloway, and indeed Carrick, in the 12th and 13th centuries. Although the lords of Galloway were never known as mormaers, at least until the end of Fergus' time, they saw themselves and were seen by others as kings, albeit subordinate in some ways to other kings, such as the King of Scots, and perhaps the King of England. The Kennedy kin group probably had a subordinate relationship with the dominant Carricks in the late 12th and 13th centuries, before themselves becoming the predominant kindred in Carrick in the 14th century. Contrary to what I wrote back in 1991, I would now tend to the view that the Galloway kin groups were subject to military or army service under their captains and on a kin base, rather than by a more public duty owed directly to the King of Scots and his kingdom as such. The kenkynnol charters consistently express the head of kindred's obligation of military leadership all the way into the middle of the 15th century, and it was clearly seen as central to the role. Payment of the tribute known as culp was certainly another part of the rights of kenkynnol. In Galloway, this tribute was payable during the lifetime of the client, whereas elsewhere in Scotland it fell due only on the death of the client. It probably took the form of handing over livestock or their more durable byproducts, such as cheese. It's from the earliest known royal confirmations made in the mid-1270s that we know that kenkynnol included what in Latin appeared as calumnies, probably best translated as claims or accusations. In my article I linked this with another known feature of Galloway law and custom, surdit de sargon in French, superdictum servientum in Latin. The accusations made by officers who were, in effect, a police force acting under their lord. They had summary powers of execution against robbers taken red-handed, i.e. in possession of the stolen goods, and in any event, those against whom they brought accusations had the burden of proving their innocence by oath helpers. It would seem that the accused could not claim to be tried by visnet, i.e. a jury, until 1324, when King Robert I granted to the captains and men of Galloway that when in future a Galwegian was accused of crime, he should have a good and faithful assize, i.e. a jury, and should not need to purge or acquit himself in accordance with the old laws of Galloway. This was subject to express exceptions for accusations against the king's own sergeants, or ones involving one of the four pleas of the crown, or treason, or the killing of foreigners. A later edition, most probably written not long after the grant by King Robert, adds that no Galwegian should enjoy the benefit of the visnet unless he had first renounced the laws of Galloway. The suggestion made in my article is that the sergeants worked on a kin rather than a territorial basis. Their function was to look out for and physically protect the interests of their lord's kindred, wherever those interests were threatened or actually infringed. Their existence and operation was thus an aspect of the protection which the head of kindred gave to that kindred. In their roaming around the countryside to exercise their functions, the sergeants were entitled to one night's hospitality, wherever they happened to be, possibly even to take it unilaterally. And this was perhaps the customary exaction against which those liable to make or suffer it perhaps railed most when the opportunity arose. A further, more tentative suggestion in the article was that these sergeants and their lord played a significant role in what has been called the justice of the feud, the system of composition or settlement between kin groups where a member of one had killed or injured a member of the other. In my article I refer to the text generally known as the Leges Interbretos et Scotos. No contemporary justification for that title, so henceforth LBS. This provides compensation tariffs dependent on the status of the victim of the wrongdoing. I cast doubt, however, on the suggestion made by Professor Barrow that LBS had a specifically Galloway origin. The most recent analysis by Dr. Alice Taylor, while agreeing with my view that the text reflects actual law and practice in 12th and 13th century Scotland, suggests that it describes the law applying in Scotia between Forth and Spey. In this study, Dr. Taylor goes on to make the interesting argument that the LBS is the production of a class of lawmen, the judex or judices, rather than of royal legislation. And these lawmen were the repositories of existing law and custom, comparable with similar figures found in medieval Wales and Ireland. Now, there's a great deal of manuscript evidence to show that in Wales and Ireland, the lawmen reduced their learning to writing in tracts and treatises. Dr. Taylor's suggestion is that the LBS is a surviving fragment of such a specialised legal writing composed by lawmen in Scotland. Now, the lawmen of 12th and 13th century Scotland often had regional affiliations, sometimes with the whole of Scotia, sometimes with constituent parts such as the earldoms of Buchan, Mearns, Angus, Gowrie, Strathearn, Lennox and Fife. The king had his own lawman, possibly known as the lawman of Scotia, with the other, more locally based lawmen under him. But there were also lawmen of Galloway, who appear as active in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. And the references to them, grouped together in a 13th century text entitled Legis Scotiae, and see also the translation on handout 2, do however suggest that the discharge of their role was not limited to Galloway proper, and that sometimes they linked with the lawmen of Scotia. Now, the first case is recorded as taking place in Dumfries, outside Galloway, and constitutes two declarations as to the laws of Galloway. First, any Galloway man convicted, whether in the judicial duel or otherwise, of breaking the king's peace, is liable to make a payment in substantial numbers of cattle to the king. Secondly, within the barras or palisade of the judicial duel, one who speaks after peace ought to be kept, apart from those who are guarding the palisade, is liable to a forfeiture of 10 cows to the king. Now, this smacks more of legislative innovation than declaration of custom. The reference to the king's peace is significant. We know that King Malcolm IV was making grants of his peace in Galloway in the 1160s, after he established Scottish control over the lordship jointly held by Gilbert and Uhtred, following the overthrow of their father Fergus. The Galloway lawmen's judgment could therefore be linked to this. A further possibility is a period in or shortly after 1186, after Roland, son of Uhtred, seized the lordship of Galloway and was confirmed therein by William, King of Scots. Whatever its exact date, the case is in part recognition of the king's authority over and above that of the Lord of Galloway. More tricky is whether or not it shows the judicial duel already well known in Galloway, as in Ireland, but not in Scotia or Wales. Or is another innovation post-1160 calling for further regulation by, say, the 1190s, which is a further alternative possibility for dating the text. By then there was definitely a royal assize of Galloway, under which the local lords of the province were to provide assistance to incoming landowners in the pursuit of thieves, very likely by way of their peace sergeants. It's thus clear that after 1160 there were repeated royal attempts to have Galloway's kin-based customs adapted to incomers without kin, as well as made subject to the king's ultimate authority. And it looks as though the lawmen of Galloway were, willingly or not, drawn into the process. But perhaps most significantly, the judgment about the king's peace and the duel suggests that the distinction between lawmen declaring law and royal lawmaking was actually more blurred than Dr. Taylor posits in her book. The second reference is to a decision in a specific case. It's recorded as taking place on 8th October at Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh, where the lawmen of Galloway and Scotia acted together to hold that, because Gillis Cop MacEdacan had not produced hostages at the appointed day and place, which he himself had pledged, or found other pledges, he ought to give sureties to the king, who would thereby be pacified. If Gillis Cop was not able to give sureties to the Lord King's will, he himself would remain as a surety until he had given the hostages he had promised. Dr. Taylor persuasively suggests, first, that as this Gillis Cop was most likely a Galloway Carrick notable, linked to Thomas de Colville, an Ayrshire landowner nicknamed the Scot, Gillis Cop had previously been involved in some way in the seditious activities for which Thomas was imprisoned between May and November 1210. Secondly, that Gillis Cop too was held as a surety after he'd failed to provide hostages, presumably as guarantors of his loyalty to the king. And thirdly, that under the judgment of the assembled lawmen, which is to be dated to 1210, Gilliscop continued to be held at least until Thomas' release on 11th November. The Galloway-Carrick connections of both Gilliscop and Thomas explain the involvement of the Galloway lawmen, although not, it must be said, that of their colleagues from Scotia. The final judgment of the Galloway lawmen took place at Lanark, again outside Galloway, in the court of the Lord King, held by Roland son of Uhtred and other good men. It seems likely that Roland presided as royal justiciar, given that we know he held that office in the 1190s. But as the Lanark venue of the case suggests, his jurisdiction in that role was probably not confined to Galloway, if indeed it was exercised there at all. It's by no means impossible, given that by marriage with the heiress of the de Morville family, Roland held many other lands outside Galloway, that he was justiciar for the whole kingdom south of Forth, and possibly the first to perform such a role. However that may be, it was adjudged by the lawmen of Galloway in the Lanark court that whenever the Lord King ought to have his cane of Galloway, his breve, i.e. his written command, should be sent to the mayors of Galloway, who should then, bearing that breve, go to the cane debtors and collect what was owed. The debtor who refused to accept the breve was to pay a forfeiture of 100 cows. Cane was almost certainly due from Galloway to the King of Scots before 1186 as an irregularly demanded tribute recognising the king's overlordship, while the Lord of Galloway was also separately entitled to claim cane for himself from his subjects within the province. Our text clearly belongs to the period after Roland's assumption of the lordship of Galloway, subject to the kingship of William the Lion in 1185. Dr. Taylor's view is that this text belongs to the earlier part of the period between 1187 and 1200, the latter being the year of Roland's death, and is most probably 1187 to 1189. But as already noted, Roland is not known to have been a justiciar until the 1190s, so it may well belong to the last decade of the 12th century. Once again, the text looks highly legislative in nature, albeit its innovation was probably in the sanction it imposed upon non-pairs, and perhaps in the preliminary requirement for a written breve. What conclusions may we draw from this short discussion? The evidence for the laws of Galloway reflects a Gaelic-speaking, kin-based order of society, justice and lordship, which, although it came under increasing pressure from the kings of Scots from the second half of the 12th century on, survived and indeed remained significant until at least the end of the 15th century. Royal pressure was generally to adapt rather than to remove the laws. It supported that by which the kingship too would be advanced. While much about the system looks rather similar to what we find elsewhere in medieval Gaelic Scotland, there were distinctively Galwegian features. Although in some sense a king to begin with, the Lord of Galloway never became a mormaer or earl in the kingdom of the Scots, and it may be that in consequence army service and the tribute renders of Calp and Cane worked on a different footing from the other parts of Scotland. Elements of kenkynnol, like the peace sergeants and even the word itself, may reflect closer earlier connections with Cumbria and even Wales rather than Ireland, a topic needing greater exploration than I've been able to provide here. Handout 3 gives some of the main points for those interested. It also gives my contact details should there be any questions or points about what I have said. I'm sorry not to be able to hear them straight away. Please do feel free to contact me by email. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak at this conference, and I wish its remaining speakers all the very best. Thank you.